Now, dissociation is a very normal thing. It's something that we all do at various times in our lives. But like anything else, too much of anything can be bad. And do we, and when one, I should say, starts relying on dissociation to function, like it becomes over-relying on dissociation, that's when it becomes a dissociative disorder. Dissociative amnesia is a loss of memory. Now, Freud called this repression. Today, we call this dissociative amnesia, usually because we've experienced something so traumatic, so horrible, so terrible that we literally block out the memory. I'm not talking about brain trauma where there's like an injury to the brain, but it's literally blanking out a memory or blocking a memory so you don't have to access it. That's dissociative amnesia. There's a rare form of it called a fugue state, where a person loses complete awareness of who they are. This is exceedingly rare, so rare that it's limited to case studies. It used to be its own mental health disorder, but now it's kind of a subsection of dissociative amnesia. So the fugue state is losing complete awareness of who one is. And usually when a person's in a fugue state, an odd characteristic is they tend to flee the situation that they're in. They strip themselves of any identity and just run away. And that's documented in numerous cases. Depersonalization, derealization disorder. This is where we've all had the experience of being on autopilot, where we're just kind of going through the motions. We're not even, it just feels like we're just kind of doing it, not really doing it. Well, what happens if it gets to the extreme where the person feels like they can't even control like their daily functions? They feel like there's what they sometimes call alien control, not literally aliens from outer space, but some other force controlling you. Okay, that's that depersonalization part. Whereas the derealization part of it is where you're questioning whether this is your reality. Sometimes we wake up and we say, "Gosh, was that a dream I had last night, or did that really happen the day before?" Think about a person who is questioning most parts of their lives. Like, is this really my reality? Am I really awake? I don't know. That's the derealization part to it. Then there is the well-known dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder, where a person takes on different identities because each identity might serve a particular function. Some people call it an ego state that it tries to serve a certain purpose, because for whatever reason, the base personality, for lack of a better phrase, the base personality is not able to handle it or do it because it's so unlike them, so that they take on a different personality and then have a dissociation. They block out that memory of that alternate personality because there's so much unlike them. Again, I'm taking a very complicated disorder and kind of simplifying it here. What's interesting is that usually at first the base personality is not aware of the other personalities, although the alternate personalities are aware of. All right, we move into another category of disorders. It's the major depressive disorder, or what we call depression. And it's often associated with sadness, but it's more than just sadness. We all have periods of sadness in our lives, but the idea behind major depressive disorder is that it's a prolonged amount of sadness with other types of things attached to it. A loss of interest and pleasure in things that used to give us lots of amount of pleasure and happiness. We might have been love playing the guitar, and then suddenly we wake up one morning and we don't want to ever touch the guitar again because we feel so sad. We can't concentrate. We feel worthless or guilty about something, maybe something that you have no control over. Getting more or less sleep, weight loss or loss of appetite, restlessness or inactivity. And it's not just, and a person could have this for a couple of hours, let's say, maybe they encounter something that was really saddening. But this is something that occurs over a 2-week period. We're not just talking about, I just had a rough hour. We're talking about 2 continuous weeks, 14 straight days of this in order to get the major depressive disorder diagnosis. There are variations of major depressive disorder that used to be their own separate things, but now kind of like subsections of this. Postpartum depression is the depression a mother feels shortly after giving birth, and she might feel sad, she might feel guilty, she might feel like she's not adequate enough to be a mother. It used to once be called the baby blues. Everyone gets over it. Well, it turns out it could be a lot more serious than that, and they take it very seriously if someone says, I'm having postpartum depression, and doctors will take that very seriously. Seasonal affective disorder usually occurs in the winter. Less sunlight, we're indoors more, and we're it kind of starts to get to people, for lack of a better way of putting it. And and there was some talk about how, even though it wasn't seasonal, during quarantine, during the shutdowns, there was maybe something that would be normally seasonal affective disorder because people were inside and didn't get out as much. But anyway, that's seasonal affective disorder. What a person calls anxiety. But here, generalized anxiety disorder is what we normally call anxiety. Low levels of anxiety that are ongoing. The person's like kind of like ongoingly nervous. It just feels like they're nervous all the time. It's not too extreme, but it's almost like they're on edge, always kind of nervous about something. Whereas panic disorder, on the other hand, is characterized by these panic attacks, which are episodes, brief episodes that might last 5-10 minutes at the most. And it's an extreme feeling of dread. They feel like they're going to die, or the world's going to end. The sympathetic nervous system kicks into high gear, heart rate's pumping very high, breathing very heavily, and so forth. It's very extreme compared to to generalized anxiety disorder. It's just like kind of like being nervous ongoing. Panic disorder is a completely different thing, where a person could be just, for lack of a better word, normal, not having the anxiety, and then suddenly, boom, comes on, is extreme. 5-10 minutes later, it goes away. And it can happen daily. It could happen once a week. It could happen once a month. The DSM does have criteria, though, about how often it has to happen. Specific phobia is an irrational fear to something. It is rational to be afraid of going into a burning fire. It's irrational to be just as afraid of a picture of a candle burning. It would, it's irrational. A person who can't live their life because they have this fear of something that's irrational, that's where it's called a specific phobia. Just to kind of give you a kind of simplified presentation here of the difference between generalized anxiety disorder and panic disorder. You can see that the generalized anxiety disorder kind of like ongoing, always there, whereas panic disorder, if this represents levels of anxiety, not too much, and suddenly very extreme every so often. Obsessive compulsive disorder. Two aspects to this, to obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessions are these thoughts that are invasive, they are causing anxiety, and they can be irrational or bizarre. And the persistence kind of makes them irrational. So a person says, I left the lights on, and not so much irrational, but the person in that case, it keeps thinking about the lights being on, and just can't stop thinking about it. And it could be irrational, where it's like the aliens are coming down. Not necessarily all people with OCD, but to an extent. Compulsions, on the other hand, are the behaviors that are rituals that repeat themselves, that are hard to hold back, with the intention of trying to alleviate the obsessions. A person, for example, the classic prototypical one being hand washing. My hands are dirty. I have to wash them. So they wash their hands. The thought being, my hands are dirty. Now, they might even know cognitively that their hands are clean enough to live their life. That, the perfect cleanliness is not possible. But yet there's still those thoughts going through their mind, my hands are dirty. And so they engage in this hand washing behavior, where they wash their hands 5, 10, 15 times, even more, to try to make those thoughts go away. Compulsions are more common. You could have compulsions without the obsessions. As a matter of fact, most cases of OCD, I would say, have compulsions but without obsessions. So that's obsessive compulsive disorder. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is where a stressor, it's something that's causing some stressor. The person experienced some stressor. It's often associated with war, but it doesn't have to be war. But they saw something traumatic. And that memory of it, it's intrusive. They get flashbacks of what happened. They're remembering when they don't want to remember. They have nightmares. And it doesn't have to be one event. It could be a series of events, too. That's one common misconception about it. But it's intruding on their lives. you're trying your best not to remember it. You're trying to stay away from the scene where it happened, let's say, or something like that, or you don't want to talk about it. A person might have sadness, amnesia, guilt. There are some people who say that PTSD might have a dissociative element to it because of the amnesia. Guilt and sadness, not surprisingly, is sometimes diagnosed as major depressive disorder instead of PTSD, or they're diagnosed at the same time. But at the same time, they could have anxiety where they're kind of on edge, having difficulty sleeping. It's almost like generalized anxiety disorder also at the same time as well. So, but again, that kind of is simplifying, and PTSD can be a lot more complicated than that. All right, feeding and eating disorders. There's anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, which are two different disorders. Some people kind of use them interchangeably, but there are some variations in common, but they are different. First, with bulimia and anorexia, there is an undue influence of body shape or weight. In other words, there's this concern about body weight or their shape when it shouldn't be there. Bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder both involve food consumption larger than what people would eat in a similar setting, and there's a sense of lack of control. So, we all had the experience of one eat, let's say, 2 or 3 Oreos, and we eat 5 Oreos. That's not what we're talking about here. This is where a person might eat the whole bag of Oreos and then move on to a loaf of bread, and a box of cereal, and it can be very and they're ingesting many thousands of calories almost, and they feel like they're just like mindlessly doing it, and they feel like they're not in control while they're eating. People with anorexia nervosa are typically underweight. There's a restriction of caloric intake. They're not putting calories into their body. Whereas bulimia nervosa, they are typically normal weight to overweight, and when they engage, or if they engage in those binges, the high amount of food consumption, they try to do something to undo it. Classically, they say, well, they regurgitate or throw up, but they also might, as a result, not eat. They might go for extreme amounts of exercise. I'm not talking about like, oh gosh, well, I'm going to take a walk. A person during Thanksgiving dinner might go for a walk. We're talking about they eat maybe a whole gallon of ice cream, and then they run all night with the intention of trying to undo it because they feel guilty about it. And that's, obviously something much more than just, oh gosh, maybe I should just go for a walk and burn off some calories. It's something much more than that. Okay. There can be sometimes a compensation strategy with anorexia, but not typically. Binge eating disorder, they tend to be typically normal weight to obese.